Yeah, for sure. And like, even if you think about boundaries, like, when I try to, embody boundaries now, like, because a lot of boundaries can tend to be quite reactive, where we're like,
Mm,
I don't want this.
yes.
And so, that our boundaries come up when we're in a state of not wanting something.
Mm,
It's a reactive boundary, or else in a state where, there's too much fluidity and there are no boundaries.
mm,
But like for me, when the boundaries come from a place of desire, from the heart, not from the head,
mm,
like, and you're bringing your boundaries out of that heart center into the world. There's just so much more power. And you can
mm,
work with the body to really infuse your boundaries, because your body is a boundary. Like your
yes.
skin is your boundary between, like, you and the world. So I often, kind of practice, like, even just tapping my body, to kind of get a felt sense of the boundary between me and the world.
Welcome to the Wildflower Diaries Show, where we have meaningful conversations and contemplations to bring you back to life. I'm Beth Schneider, your host and guide, to help you along your healing journey and to really start living life fully. We have forgotten that we are the builders, creators, weavers, lovers, visionaries and dreamers. Through these discussions, learn and implement practices to remember and reconnect to all of who you are. Your body, intuition, power, heart, voice, mind and magic are ready to be reclaimed so that you can make ripple effects of change that you know deep down you are made for. Let's get started with this week's episode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to what's going to be the first conversation in the Wildflower Diary shows. And I'm very, very excited because I'm joined today by Jen, who owns the Celtic School of Embodiment and is actually a very dear friend and has been a huge part of my journey of embodiment. So, yeah, I'm excited to be having a conversation with her today.
Oh, thank you, Beth. Just such an honor to be here with you today as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for agreeing. And do you want to maybe first tell us a little bit about yourself and the Celtic School of Embodiment, and then then we'll just chat.
Yeah, amazing. So I'm Jen and I live in Ireland. Um, and yeah, I'm the founder of the Celtic School of Embodiment. And what my work really involves is, fusing the ancient wisdom of Celtic mythology that is rooted in the Irish tradition with the emerging field of feminine embodiment coaching to transform life for modern day women. So it's really this fusion of mythology with the body, as a catalyst for change for the times that we find ourselves in today.
Yeah, and I can attest that it's amazing. So, one thing I'd like to maybe help people understand is what an embodiment actually is. Before we go into the awesome mythology side of things.
Yeah, so I guess like embodiment for me, there's many ways to look at embodiment, but for me, it's really about becoming alive to the sensations of your body, being able to be in your body and move through your thoughts, your emotions, your feelings, your felt senses in real time in your body, because often we're conditioned to only accept certain aspects of ourselves, like
Mm,
good emotions, and maybe the more negative emotions like anger or jealousy or frustration, are rejected by our societies. And so we
mm,
reject them in our bodies. And that, with that comes a myriad of problems, because
mm,
like if we reject aspects of ourselves, we're just really numbing ourselves out, we're disassociating, and that lives on in the body. So for me, you know, embodiment is really the journey home to the body, of really coming home to ourselves and the full spectrum of life in the body and being able to move through that. And I suppose just, you know, to maybe mention the feminine aspect of it then as well, because it's particularly feminine embodiment for me. And the reason why, you know, the focus for me is on feminine embodiment is because often, you know, it's the feminine aspect, you know, of our essence that we really reject, because we live in a very, you know, hyper masculine, hyper productive world. So we're very skilled, you know, at maybe linear thinking and not very skilled at cyclical living, you know, and particularly the feminine, you know, women's bodies in particular are cyclical, you know, so accepting more of that, you know, being able to inhabit the feminine, you know, from a much more empowered place as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in a world where like mindset is everything is the phrase, it really is important work to also realize that the mind is not the only thing that is important about us. When, you know, we've forgotten that our bodies, we've forgotten our hearts, and we're just living in this very logical, rational world where we don't allow ourselves to actually sink into our bodies. And in some ways, like from my experience, like how I actually found you was, number one, okay, I'm from Irish ancestry, so that was the first thing that kind of came forward. But I had completely left my body from going through traumatic events. So it was actually, for me, I had to start in the mind and then move to the body. But I think some people start in the body and then move to the mind. So when it comes to this, how do we get past, you know, that mind and move more into the body, especially if someone's been through trauma, for example?
Yeah, so like if you've been through, you know, trauma, then like trauma like does cause us often to leave our body because it's very painful to be in the body, you know, and it depends on the level of trauma, you know, could be a micro trauma or you know, or a full-blown, you know, traumatic event that has happened in your life, you know, and in that case, I think you would need support to get back into your body, you know, but really like this is all about developing interoception, and interoception is the ability to be able to feel what is happening in your body, because often with trauma we numb ourselves out or we disassociate, and so we can't actually feel what's happening in our body, you know, and there's so much wisdom to, you know, knowing what's happening in our body, because, you know, when we can access that inner world, you know, and influence that inner world, we have more agency and more influence in our outer world, you know, and how we move through the world. And yeah, like just on the mindset, you know, approach, like, you know, and there is value in that, but that just never worked for me. No matter how much I worked on my mindset, I just still couldn't get rid of like some of these kind of deep-rooted conditioning, limiting beliefs that I have. And, you know, for me, it's like a lifetime process, you know, it's ongoing. I will never have everything sussed, you know, and I'm okay with that, you know, just having the tools to support myself, you know, around this. But for me, like, you know, when I reflect on this, like, you know, we're only about, like, neuroscientists reckon that we're only maybe 5 to 10% conscious of what's happening at any given time. You know, so we've got about 90% of unconscious intelligence. And for me, a huge amount of that is in the body. So we're not tapping into like a whole world of wisdom that is available to us. And when we can, you know, be in our bodies and develop interoception, the level of trust in ourselves that comes with that. Now it takes time, you know, and it takes a lot of practice, but the level of trust that that provides, you know, for me, it's like the word really is astounding. Do you know what I mean? Like it astounds me what being in the body can do for your life. Yeah.
It is, and I think this word trust is very important in this situation, because I think what happens is we often have that, specifically as women, that gut feeling, that knowing that, okay, something's not right, and often we betray ourselves and actually go against what we know within our bodies, And often that's where we're losing that trust with ourselves, and it's almost like a sense of betrayal where we don't trust ourselves anymore, and we don't trust those feelings in our body. So I really know the value of like being able to actually feel into those things, and instead of just trying to make a fast-paced decision on things all the time, is to just sit with it and actually be like, what is my body telling me in this moment? And I think mind, you can think about, let's set boundaries, for example. That's in a mental aspect of it, it's like easy to do, like if you think about it. But when you actually sit and feel what's happening in your body, like when it contracts and constricts, or your voice and doesn't want to actually say the words, that's where like understanding your body and how it's works and what's happening within it can be really helpful, instead of just trying to think logically of how you're going to do things.
Yeah, for sure. And like, even if you think about boundaries, like, when I try to, embody boundaries now, like, because a lot of boundaries can tend to be quite reactive, where we're like, I don't want this. And so, that our boundaries come up when we're in a state of not wanting something. It's a reactive boundary, or else in a state where, there's too much fluidity and there are no boundaries, But like for me, when the boundaries come from a place of desire, from the heart, not from the head, like, and you're bringing your boundaries out of that heart center into the world, there's just so much more power. And you can work with the body to really infuse your boundaries, because your body is a boundary. Like your skin is your boundary between like you and the world, So I often, kind of practice, like even just tapping my body, to kind of get a felt sense of the boundary between me and the world, and do different kind of practices, to feel, to kind of really infuse those boundaries with my desire by moving my body and different things. Like the body's an incredible tool as well, to be able to really fuel our desires.
Yes. And the Celtic side of things, so obviously you've studied all of these stories and what have you, so maybe you can tell us a bit more about that, and how that's kind of infused in the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I suppose like if I start maybe, kind of like, it really starts from childhood for me, because my grandmother, who was heavily involved in our lives, Frances O'Sullivan was her name, and she was from Pimlico, in inner city Dublin, a real working class area of Dublin. And she was like an incredible storyteller. Her mother was a storyteller before her mother before her. We've kind of this, a lineage traced in terms of like her own kind of storytelling tradition. And so she, just infused this absolute like fascination in me in Irish folklore, and yeah, just the stories that I grew up on, and so like when I left school, then I ended up doing this degree in Medieval Irish and Celtic Studies, and studying the mythology from a more academic perspective. And I fused this with anthropology as well, because I was always fascinated with culture in general. So with Irish culture, Irish traditions, Irish lore, but also beyond Irish shores, cross-culturally, different, how different cultures bring story and myth to life, and all of that. And and then I worked like for 14 years in international development as an anthropologist. I specialized in critical pedagogy, which is looking at the power structures at play in our own learning experiences. And then, a few years ago, the mythology, like it was always there kind of simmering in the background, but it just started to come back like an activation. It was just coming into my dream world, particularly Queen Maeve, who, I know you have a deep relationship with as well. And I like was kind of ended up discovering like all of my old notes from my degree. Like, I'm not a hoarder at all, but I'd kept absolutely everything from my Celtic Studies degree, and I just started inhaling everything again. And you know, at the time I was training to be a feminine embodiment coach, so I just started to follow the breadcrumbs, and I started to see, oh, interesting, the more I'm coming home to my body, the more I'm coming home to mythology and to the indigenous traditions of this land. And like, it's always been there, but when I studied mythology, I studied it as an academic. So this is different. This is, you know, before I studied it very much from a kind of logical perspective. Whereas from this place, it was more of a felt sense, like it was going into my body in a whole new way. And yeah, the Celtic School of Embodiment basically unfurled from that. You know, I nearly find it hard to explain, you know, how it came to be.
Yeah.
Because it was literally breadcrumb by breadcrumb by breadcrumb.
Which is, I think, the amazing part of it is like actually finally starting to follow the breadcrumbs can lead you to the most amazing discoveries of who you are and what you're meant to be doing in the world. And I almost feel like it's almost was like a reclamation, what you went through there, of reclaiming the stories in a different way. And it's actually quite nice for us to then speak a little bit about Queen Maeve, because obviously when I first started working with you, she came through first for me as well as when I connected very much to her story. And when we went into it, I realized she's from West Island, and that's where my ancestors come from. And it was very much like, wow, okay. So what do you feel we could take from her story? I know there's a lot about shame in her story, and how shame shows up in our body and how we can kind of start shifting that for ourselves.
Yeah, so like Queen Maeve is like a really powerful figure in Irish mythology. She's a warrior queen, but you know, in the way her story is told, and remembering that like the stories would have likely, you know, originally existed long before in our oral tradition, right? So passed down intergenerationally, particularly by the Fili, so the poets of Ireland, and the Druids. Okay, so they were the people who held the lore, and you know, it was an oral tradition. But then with the arrival of Christianity to Ireland, these stories started to be written down by Christian monks. So, you know, they obviously had a particular worldview as well, that they were, you know, adding a layer to these stories based on their own kind of belief system. So when you look at Maeve, you know, like Maeve in her story really is centered around Táin Bó Cúailnge, which means the cattle raid of Cooley, and it's a great kind of Irish epic. And she really is vilified in that tale as an example of a woman with too much power and a woman with a weak husband. So her husband is Aliel, and you know, he's like, it's like he's not worthy of the kingship, and you know, she is just so powerful. It's an example of when, you know, a woman has too much power, there's a weak husband, and she just, you know, becomes so greedy and hungry for power, you know. But when you look at Maeve's story, like Maeve originally is likely a ancient sovereignty goddess, you know, and she gets humanized in this story, but she's likely an old goddess, a goddess of the land, because Maeve's name means she who intoxicates. And this gives us a lot of clues, because, you know, the sovereignty goddess in ancient Ireland was an expression of the land, of nature, of the feminine. And, you know, she was married then to the king through a ritual called the Banish Rigi. And so it means kind of wedding feast of, you know, kingship, where the goddess would offer a wedding libation, usually in the form of mead, you know, the oldest form of alcoholic drink, to the king. And this was a symbol of, you know, the feminine and the masculine, you know, in divinity together, you know, and the marriage of the people and the land, you know. So there's those old ancient tones from Maeve, but in the story itself, she gets kind of vilified then as this human, you know, and has too much power, because her legacy of power is always there. Even when she's humanized, you know, you can't take away her power. And there's a really kind of an example that really sticks in my kind of sphere around Maeve is in the Cattle Raid of Cooley, in this story. You know, there's a point in the battle where Maeve gets her bleed, you know, she's menstruating. And, you know, she says to Fergus, a warrior who, you know, she's fighting, who's fighting by her side, you know, I have to go and relieve myself. And he's like, oh, for God's sake, you know, like, this couldn't be, you know, this couldn't be a worse time, you know, and there's a shaming of her as a woman, you know, and even like when she bleeds and when she goes off to relieve herself, the blood digs 3 great channels in the land, each enough to move a household. Okay, so she's land shaping through her blood, which is like, you know, an ancient sign of the goddess as well. But where this happens, the scribe says, is called, you know, Maeve's foul place. So again, trying to shame her as a woman. I mean, the height of battle, for God's sake, now she's bleeding, now she's menstruating, you know, and, you know, it's called Maeve's foul place. But still, you know, the power is there because her bleed actually moves the land. It shapes the land. So even when you're trying to kind of take away her power and shame her, her power just keeps coming back. It keeps simmering through the story. So for me, Maeve is like a reclamation of, you know, of our power, because for women in particular, I feel a lot of our power is taken away from us through shame. Shame is a really effective tool of the patriarchy, like the most effective tool of the patriarchy to take away women's power. Shame a woman, you'll destroy her power. It's the easiest way to take away her power. And so we have to, you know, release our shame to claim back our power. And Maeve, for me, is a real symbol of this from our mythology.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think about it, because our voice is like, when you said it, it's like sits in your voice almost. That shame cuts your voice. It really makes you feel like, well, what, everyone's going to know something about me if I put myself out there, if I stand up. And we get shamed without even realizing it from a very young age, to just be good girls and you know, depending on some families, to be seen and not heard. So it's very much this like reclaiming your power and reclaiming your voice when you let go of shame and realize that a lot of the things we've been shamed for are actually very human, you know, and are part of being human. So yeah, she is very powerful, and I'm very so how do you also feel, you know, you have all these different stories from all these different mythical ancestors of Ireland. How do they relate then to women today? We've just spoken a bit more about Maeve, but, you know, say for example, if someone isn't of Irish ancestry, where would you say that is a good place for them to start if they're wanting to then reclaim the stories of their land, for example?
Yeah, so it's really to start with the stories, with the mythology, you know, and to learn about your own traditions, you know. And I know that's not always possible because people don't always know exactly where their ancestors are from, you know, so finding the stories can be a challenge, you know, and there's layers and layers to this. Like even in Ireland, you know, like not everybody would have a full view of our mythology at all, because there's layers and layers of conditioning here between, you know, British imperialism, you know, when we were under colonial rule, you know, then the Catholic Church. Like our mythology is often presented to us as children's stories. And so children's stories like fantastical, you know, that's not, you know, that's not a you know, they're just children's stories. Whereas actually the purpose of myth is, you know, to teach people around what it inherently means to be a human being with a soul's calling as part of your community and how you contribute to your community and the world. So yeah, so for me, like it really is that process of just trying to connect with the stories of your lineage, even if you don't know exactly where that is. Even the part of the world that those stories come from can just be so powerful, you know. and also viewing it with, yeah, like making meaning with the stories, like looking at the stories and not just kind of seeing them for what they are, because these stories are meant to evolve. Mythology is meant to evolve for the times that we are in, so looking at the stories as well, and really, making meaning, like noticing what's happening in your body when you read this story. What does this mean for me and my life? And also, like, something that can be really powerful in engaging with mythology as well is to be able to see the archetypes at
Yes.
play in the stories, because archetypes, come from the collective unconscious, but they come through in different forms according to the culture they're in. So say if you take like the wise old woman who's the Cailleach in the Irish tradition and in the Scottish tradition, she, may appear as spider grandmother in like the Hopi or Navajo tradition. It's the same similar archetypal energy, but it has to take on a different form so that it's meaningful for that culture.
For that culture,
so starting to look at, okay, who's this character in this story and what type of archetype do they represent? Have I seen this archetype before in my life? What does this mean for me in my life? And what energy could this archetype teach me? And then what is this shadow? What's the darker side of this archetype, and can I see that in my life, playing out in my life? So yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but
it does,
that would be a starting point for me.
Yeah, and I think it's also like what you were talking about earlier about like following the breadcrumbs. Really, I mean, I'm from South Africa, and I kind of came to the Celtic mythology through getting interested in African spirituality and seeing also where did this stop? Where did these practices get taken away? And looking at history and understanding it from not just the lens of how it's taught to us from the eyes of the person who won, and actually looking at it through what else could be true here. And obviously that's something that I find interesting, but I actually have found it's connected me so much more to where I am currently living and to my ancestry, which and also claiming the other parts of my ancestry where there is still shame that we don't always want to look at, that we want to just say we must all move forward from, and looking at the stories and seeing the similarities, like you say, actually also then makes us see how we've all made meaning and how can we come back together as communities. I think story has such a powerful way of doing that too. So yeah,
for sure. And there's not a huge amount of research yet into story and embodiment, because like I'm really curious around this, but there is like research into the neuroscience of stories, and actually what happens in the brain, in reaction to story. And like, it's really fascinating when you delve into this in terms of like the connection, in terms of releasing dopamine and releasing oxytocin, the love hormone, that helps us connect with other people. Like storytelling fuels our empathy. It's such a powerful has such a powerful response, like even in our brains, and it can help us make new neural pathways in our brains, new ways of actually seeing and being in the world. So it's such a potent tool, and it's something that our ancestors just innately understood. I feel like we're only catching up with what like the ancient, say poets and druids of Ireland intuitively knew, even though they didn't have any, science to prove it, that we're actually catching up with that now.
Yeah, and I think we're all looking for meaning in these times where it's so difficult to, like, one thing I've really had to look at is how do we look at the pain of the world and not turn our eyes and not try to not look and numb it out and pretend it's not happening. And I think also looking into my ancestry has really helped me do that, because you have to look at the pain, and then it makes you look at the pain in your own life and actually deal with it head on with an open heart instead of closing your heart off to the world. And I think something I really found is the question that comes up a lot in the work I do and have came up in my life a lot is, what's the point? And I think often stories help us answer that question. The point's love, the point's community, the point's us connecting and healing and moving forward as a community, I think, Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. It really is. It's just such a powerful tool,
Yeah.
and we really need it for our times,
Yes. Yeah.
and it
So
really roots us as well,
it does roots us, and I think this is it. It's reclaiming your body and reclaiming your roots is like a grounding. It really is about freeing yourself physically. Helps you start to free yourself, spiritually too. So yeah. So who's your favorite mythical woman?
Well, I mean, I'd probably say like the first that comes to my mind is Maeve, in the sense that because Maeve, so even though, yeah, I know I said I'd studied like mythology from quite an academic perspective originally, still I had this incredible lecturer called Myrnie Vrolcoin, who has since, sadly passed on, but she was a huge inspiration because I did studies with her of women in early Irish literature. And I remember studying misogyny and Maeve. I don't think I'd even heard the word misogyny at that time, like I knew what it meant. And it just opened, Maeve kind of opened this whole world of, hang on a minute, it was a whole world of awareness around society and misogyny. And it came through a mythical ancestor, but it woke me up to, the world around me and, the misogyny around me.
Yeah.
That I really, in my late teens just didn't, I just wasn't aware of. So I feel like Maeve, I'm forever grateful to Maeve for that, and to Myrne, because, it was an activation as such, and really, yeah, planted such a seed, and really influenced my life, even my work in international development and social justice and all of that kind of stuff. Maeve was a big catalyst in that. So yeah, she's always the first one that comes,
Yeah.
to me, and yeah, so I'd probably say Maeve. Yeah.
And I find that, it's interesting you say that, because I think growing up, it's quite interesting that we don't always, it's normal what we experience. It's been like, this is just the way things are. And it's only when you start to grow up and you get that awareness of what's happening in the world that you're like, hang on a minute, this isn't actually normal. We've just normalized things that are completely toxic and are hurting all of us, and that's, I think I only really woke up to it in my 30s, to be honest, when I had my big burnout and started asking questions about the world. Before then, I was so caught up in the should do's of life, like you must go get your job, get your house or car or whatever, marry, have this many kids. Like, we just go on this set out route until something wakes us up and like, okay, got to look at things a little bit differently here, and before I was just like, that's just how these cultures are, and you've just got to fit into it and not change it, not rock the boat. And I think a lot of these mythical women are also teaching us how to actually use our voices and actually rock the boat, because it's not normal the way that we're currently living. It's not, it is something that needs to be changed,
Yeah, for sure. Because everything, culture creates. So everything in our culture is created by humans.
Yeah.
And I remember that was another, because I was studying anthropology at the time, when I was doing the mythology, and I was just like, hang on a minute as well, because culture, that's just human creation, a human way of viewing the world. And what's really empowering about this is that it means that it can be changed.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? It means that, okay, well, if we created this, we can change it,
yes.
But obviously there's a lot of vested interest in us not changing it, But I do remind myself of that, okay, this is human made, and therefore, it can be changed. But I suppose the problem with our conditioning is it's so deep rooted you know, it's like such a form of power over,
Yeah.
because it's reflected back to us as the reality.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a sinister form of power in that way, because of power over it. Like, it takes away our power because it's reflected back to us as, well, this is how things are.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And like, the more of us though that question how things are, the more fundamentally we can change, you know, in our societies. Yeah.
Which I think is what we're seeing a lot at the moment, is people starting to question, you know, why are we where we're at, you know. And for me personally, going backwards has helped me move forward. And a lot of times we've also been taught not to dwell on the past. I think that's why a lot of these things around history and even like mythology sometimes have been lost, because we mustn't dwell on what's happened. But I actually think it's not about dwelling, it's about reviewing, looking at, feeling into, not trying to, like you also say, put rose-tinted glasses on certain things. There was also parts of it that was not 100% great either, you know, and claiming that and being like, okay, I've got to also look at it from both angles. It's not just, you know, the ancient, a lot of people are talking about this ancient future of bringing, you know, old wisdom and into the current way of doing, but we've also got to look at some of the things that happened shouldn't really be brought forward, because they were also not 100% above board either. So
yeah, no, I'd completely agree with that. Like, ancient Ireland was no utopia for women.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and often when we try to reimagine the past, or kind of go back to the past, or like, you know, like, and maybe Ireland, like very far back, was kind of matrilineal or matriarchal, or, you know, more kind of, we know there's a lot of mother goddess energy in the land, but, you know, where we have, you know, where our mythical stories come from, you know, that time in Ireland was like no utopia for women, you know. But like, so for me, it's not about like, it's not about trying to, you know, like go back in time and, you know, live in that way, like at all. It's about reimagining that wisdom, because there is so much inherent wisdom in it, and particularly the nature-based wisdom, because it's so fused in cyclical, like, you know, in that kind of cyclic wisdom and that correlation with, you know, with nature, you know, taking that wisdom and reimagining it for our times, you know, not trying to, you know, relive it. That just can't work. And that's not, you know, like, that's like, we're, you know, time evolves, and, you know, that was for that specific time, so we have to see it for our times, you know. And like, that's how mythology and archetypes work. They evolve, you know, we have to evolve.
And it's about taking it and, like you say, and reimagining what does it mean for us and for us moving forward, and reclaiming ourselves, basically, so that we can have the courage to do what's needed to actually move forward, because it takes courage. It takes courage to go against the grain and do things differently.
No, for sure.
So last question, the whole conversation is to bring you back to life. So I really, you know, the reason I wanted to have that as part of like sort of what the show is about is because I really feel a lot of us live on the periphery of our lives. We sit on the edge and don't really dive in, and there's so many different reasons why we do that, but so many people come forward not just feeling like they're existing. So what do you feel like coming back to life means for you, and what would you suggest people can do to kind of start bringing themselves back to life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, you reminded me of an Oscar Wilde quote, which I will only be able to paraphrase. I'm bad at remembering quotes, but he said something like, you know, to live a life is like the greatest kind of blessing or honor or joy or whatever, because he says most people exist and that is all, you know. So like, just to kind of, like, I just love that question. And I suppose, you know, like for me, like what has brought me back to life, you know, like maybe using that as an example, is really coming home to my mythical ancestors, coming home to my body, and from that place, coming home to my calling following those breadcrumbs, you know. But like, yeah, so I suppose bringing back, like coming back to life for me really is coming back to my body and to the world of wisdom that exists in my body, but that's also connected to my lineage and to my ancestry, because the rootedness that that provides in my body and in my life is just, you know, as I said at the start, it's astounding, you know.
Yeah.
So for me, that has been a huge source of bringing me back to life, because I was like, you know, when I worked in international development, I was like totally hyper productive. You know, my body came second. You know, productivity was valued above all else. So I did have to go through a process of coming back to life. But it started, it was in tandem, the mythology, my lineage, and my body. And then that enabled me to follow the breadcrumbs to my calling.
Oh, so beautiful. And I can also say like that for me, it has also brought me back to life, coming back to my roots, you know, and the work you do is just profound. That's the word I will use for it. And yeah, and thank you for following the breadcrumbs. So where can people find you, and yeah, where can they find you?
Yeah, so my website is just celticembodiment.com, or you can find me on Instagram, and my handle is just at Celtic Embodiment. Yeah.
Awesome. And also, yeah, you do amazing. I'm actually currently on your IMRAM, which will you be doing another one next after this one finishes, or what do you have
Yeah,
planned?
I'm kind of, you know, like I'll be planning now over the summer and seeing, you know, kind of what evolves. So yeah, I'll definitely have some offerings coming in the autumn as well, for sure. And I'm developing kind of a series of instant access courses at the
Yes.
moment. I have one live around, you know, reclaiming your sealskin with the selkie. So reclaiming our feminine expression with the shape-shifting seal woman. But I'm hoping to offer more of those over the summer as well.
Yes. Yeah, and the Selkie is another one. So yeah, if you want to dip in already, go and check that one out, because yeah, I mean, reclaiming your sealskin, yeah, it's part of us reclaiming ourselves. So yeah, it's amazing. Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. And yeah, I will also put all your details underneath the episode. Thank you
so much. Muile buicas.
Thank you.